So hello everyone and welcome to the first Making Public History seminar for 2021. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building. The Making Public History series is presented through a partnership between the History Council of Victoria, the Monash University History Program and the Old Treasury Building. And in conversation just before we started, Al Thompson mentioned that he thinks it's been going now for 13 years, so that's pretty extraordinary. In days past, of course, it met in person in the Old Treasury Building, and perhaps we'll be able to resume there later in the year. But for now, we are a digital event. I'd like to begin this evening by paying my respects to the people of the Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands I live and work. But of course, you, our audience, come tonight from many places, and so I would like to pay my respects to all First Nations elders, past, present, and future. I also extend a special welcome to our three speakers for the evening. They are, in order of presentation, Dr. Carolyn Rasmussen, Dr. Kathleen Neal, and Dr. Alana Piper. It's just lovely to have you with us this evening. Before I begin the seminar this evening, a little bit of housekeeping. I'm trying to move my slides along, and what was working perfectly before is not working now. So it should be showing you some housekeeping. Let me tell you, and I'll see if I can sort it out as I go. We're using this evening webinar technology, courtesy of Al Thompson and Monash. And you might have noticed that you're not visible by video and that you have been muted. That is entirely intentional, but it should absolutely not stop you communicating. Indeed, we want you to do that enthusiastically. So to ask a question of our speakers, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens and type in the question. Susie Prochke from Monash University will be monitoring those questions and passing them on to your speakers. You can remain anonymous if you want to do so, just let us know that that's what you want. If you have a technical issue or want to make another comment, please use the chat button at the bottom. And just to confirm, we will be recording this session in its entirety, so you will be able to catch it later. Now, tonight's seminar topic, Teasing Women's Stories from the Archives, was to have been presented at this time last year as a contribution to celebrating Women's History Month, which takes place each March in Victoria. Now, that event was an early casualty of the COVID-19 pandemic. We organised that discussion partly to combine with an exhibition at the Old Treasury Building called Wayward Women, which some of you may have seen. Now, as it happens, also because of the pandemic, that exhibition is still there. So if you haven't had a chance to come in and see it, please do so. And if not, don't despair, because it is all up on the website anyway, in even more detail. The format for this evening is for each of our three speakers to present for about 15 minutes. My colleague Alicia Cerrito from the History Council of Victoria will manage a 5-minute period of questions and discussion after each speaker's presentation. And then there'll be a longer period of discussion and questions at the end, which is hosted by Susie Prochke. So in that way, I hope that everybody will have an opportunity to ask a question and participate in the discussion. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker this evening, Dr. Carolyn Rasmussen. Carolyn is a public historian who lives in Victoria. She's widely published, and her most recent book is the prize-winning biography of a rather remarkable political couple, the Blackburns, Private Lives, Public Ambition. But she also chairs the Victorian Working Party of the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and she will speak tonight about the challenges that work entails. Her paper is entitled, "They Just Need a Little More Effort and Research to Track Down, Addressing the Gender Imbalance in the Australian Dictionary of Biography." So welcome, Carolyn. Let me stop sharing. And you begin.
Thank you. Am I here? Yes, here I am.
You are.
Anyway, I can see you mostly, not myself, but I suppose I should start by saying that perhaps what I'm presenting tonight is more an overview than an experience. But anyway, it's the context in which most of us work, I think. I would just like to start today with the observation that archives may not be the best place to go looking for information about overlooked women, or any person for that matter, because only a very small number of people leave much material evidence of their existence beyond official records of births and deaths and so forth. So as someone who came to history a long time ago with a passion to write history from below, I know from painful experience the highways and byways of the obscure sources we need to travel. I like better the question Professor Melanie Nolan, Director of the National Centre for Biography, posed back in March 2019. Why don't we know their names? And this, despite what amounts to half a century of concerted effort to tease out those women who are in the archives. There is no shortage of significant women there, that is, women whose lives encompassed achievements and influence that was worthy of record alongside that of men in our national story. Indeed, in some cases, they outshone the men whose careers have been celebrated, and often against considerable odds. They were just overlooked for reasons we now understand, but redress is slow. Oh, good. I'm having some trouble seeing my screen. Oh, here we go. That's it. Yeah, but, right, okay. I'm not sure how this is working very well. Back in 2016, when Melanie initiated the Colonial Women Project, the statistics were grim. The proportion of women in volumes 1 and 2, published in 1966 and 67, was a meagre 1.8%. This includes shared and minor entries, so really it's worse than that. The supplementary missing persons volumes, published in 2005, added 504 subjects. 161 of those were women, that is just on 30%. But the coverage of women for the period 1788 to 1850 remained very low at just 24. So the ADB has only 45 women subjects before 1850. Concerns in the 1970s and 80s about the absence of women from the ADB had produced some redress, led by Heather Ridey and Helen Jones. Some of you may have contributed to their efforts to begin the long process of recovering the stories of significant but overlooked women. This was, of course, just one manifestation of the considerable effort that has been in train since then, and the results have appeared in a wide range of publications. Profiting from this effort, the proportion of women in the ADB reached 20% in volumes 13 and 14, published in 1993 and 1996. A measure of the progress being made was the inclusion of a full-length entry by me on Doris Blackburn, who, like so many of the women, had appeared in a previous volume, but only as a supplementary paragraph in her husband's entry. As an aside, it did give me considerable pleasure to include the two brothers of notable headmistress Elizabeth Kirkhope as mere paragraphs in her entry in volume 15. However, somewhat embarrassingly, I have to report that the number of women in the latest volume, number 19, which will be launched next week on the 9th of March, is only 120 entries out of 680, or 18%. Overall, the proportion of women in the ADB is still only about 12%. Perhaps I should also confess that of my own 17 entries to date, only 5 are women, that is 30%, but only slightly above average. Perhaps I've let the side down a bit. Perhaps I should also pause here to remind you that the ADB was always intended to tell the story of the nation through the lives of Australians, both significant and representative. An enterprise in which, as Jerry Walsh, one of the most prolific contributors to the ADB, put it, the very humble and even disreputable are side by side with their country's most exalted and honoured citizens, providing a representative sample of the Australian experience. Clearly, that makes the absence of women all the more reprehensible. But this absence is a reflection of the wider problem of the paucity of sources from which to build rich biographies. This paucity of course, reflects the low value placed on women's lives and their achievements in the wider social and economic context, and the tendency of women to undervalue their own achievements and those of other women. And even when they are in the archives and the ADB, as I found when writing on women leaders in medicine in 20th century Australia, they often appear to have earned their place there as much for their social connections and their philanthropic activities as their medical achievements, roles that were less challenging to female stereotypes, as was their dominant focus on women and children's health. The problem, much of the time, is one of excavating women from the back rooms and deep shadows of history and challenging their own self-effacing activity just as much as the deliberate downplaying of women's contribution to many enterprises and areas of life. The kind of deep search that this entails is, of course, exactly what attracts most of us to history. And the result of our efforts shines a brighter light on our past and undoubtedly provides inspiration for the present. Notwithstanding the statistics quoted above, the work of redress in the ADB is progressing, at least for the colonial period. Back in 2016, the search began for 1,500 new entries about women who flourished in the colonial period. To date, 800 women have been nominated, and in many ways, their nominators are just as interesting as the women themselves. It shines a light on the range of people bringing the stories of women out into the bright light of day and reinforces the argument that their absence from the historical record is largely a matter of bias and prejudice, even carelessness, rather than lack of ability or achievement. The project is plagued by insufficient resources, an insufficiency that affects the entirety of the ADB project. Its success to date is a testament to the vast amount of work that's been done on a volunteer basis since it started in the early 1960s. Jerry Walsh, who I mentioned earlier, contributed 236 entries. So in this case, people writing entries for love rather than money is the norm, not just another example of the way women have often had to do things. As of about now, an advisory body on the broader issue of women's representation in the ADB, chaired by Dr. Karen Fox, research fellow within the National Centre of Biography and research editor of the ADB, is being set up. The first task of this Women Australia Working Party will be to seek funding for the Colonial Women's Project and then to begin the process of commissioning articles. Despite the volunteer nature of the ADB enterprise, the administration and final editing work does require paid staff. So who are these women whose names have been recovered from obscurity? I thought I'd give you a taste by briefly noting a few details about the women whose images were chosen for the front cover of the 25-page supplement printed in the Canberra Times in association with Inside Story and the National Centre for Biography in honour of Women's History Month back in March 2019. Of the 28 women whose fascinating stories have lain languishing in the archives, 11 were chosen to grace the front page. So this will be a whirlwind trip of little more than headlines, but it will give you some sense of the scope of the lives that are being recovered. Starting at the top, with the contemplative woman sporting what is almost certainly a 1920s bob, I can only wonder if there is something emblematic about the fact that she is nowhere to be found in the supplement. So moving right along, we have Ella McFadden, who had, we are told, a slight bias towards eels and lizards. She was a writer, editor, and reviewer driven by a lifelong love of nature and a delight in the magic of childhood. She left a significant legacy of drawings, paintings, behind the scenes, as is the editor's lot, her touch can be found in many children's classics, not the least The Adventures of Blinky Bill. Moving to the next row, we have Mary Morton Allport, a painter, a teacher, and a very superior woman, who fitted drawings and paintings around raising children and many household duties. She left a significant legacy of drawings, paintings, and writings to enrich the work of later historians of Tasmania. Next, with the lovely veil across her face, we have Julia Moore, the pioneering envoy who waged war on Canberra. One of the first 3 women appointed to Australia's diplomatic service in 1943. She was appointed 3rd Secretary to the United Nations in 1946, but her career in that area, as with the other women, would be thwarted by the marriage bar. Catapelvid Margaret Pinky Mack was a Piltangeri woman who lived her culture, providing remarkable detail in song and corroboree about the history of her people, dating back to the time of Charles Sturt's arrival in her lands in 1831. Martina, captured here in a gorgeous portrait by Tasmanian artist Thomas Bock, is given to us as a brief life seen through wild, bright eyes. Adopted by Jane Franklin into Government House in Hobart and educated there for a time, she was later sent to Oyster Cove, where she almost certainly died young. The image on the far left is of Kathleen Usher, headlined "Another Brilliant Career." Usher was at various times an illustrator, author, civil servant, hospital orderly, and Hollywood journalist. This photo is of her in a wren, as a wren, that is, a member of the Women's Royal Navy Service in 1918. She was one of the first members to be sent on active service all the way to Gibraltar. Well-connected, widely travelled, and a friend of Miles Franklin, this was one woman whose colourful life was unlikely to be overlooked, even if she has not made it into the ADB. Beside her is Jessie Chubby Miller, whose life was a long adventure in aviation. Hers is an impressive list of firsts set in the early years of flying, but her life turned dangerous and tragic. Again, another story that is well told in a number of places, but is testament to just how much young women of determination could achieve. She certainly has a secure place in the history of Australian aviation, or actually aviation more generally. The elderly woman on the bottom row is Lim Lee Si, matriarch of Darwin's Chinese community. Her story is one that fits beautifully into the representative category as she negotiates the trials, sadnesses, successes, and joys of a life well lived. Next along is my personal favourite, Roma Craze. Roma went from Melbourne to Bletchley Park and back. Bletchley Park, for those of you not into computer history, was the headquarters of the British code breakers during World War II. Craze was one of 5 women seconded to the secret facility, the work at which has been estimated to have shortened the war by between 2 and 4 years. Although there for the entire duration of the war, she was bound to lifetime secrecy, punishable by the death penalty, and never spoke of her role. It was the archivist at her old school, PLC, whose interest in her was piqued and managed to tease this story from the archives. Finally, there is Isa Coughlin, a pioneering doctor, one of the first 2 women to graduate from Sydney University's medical school. She went into private practice and served in a myriad of roles that required her expertise, paving the way for the generation who followed her. This particular entry has been researched and written by Karen Fox, who I mentioned earlier is to be the chair of the Women Australia Working Party. I am, of course, very excited about these developments. My only regret personally is that the focus at present is on colonial women. As an historian of the 20th century, I have a long list of missing women I would love to write about. I may not live long enough to do it though. So I'm going to finish by telling you about Doris. No, not Doris Blackburn, but Doris Carter. Quite serendipitously, Doris leapt out of the archives late last week, just in time for me to include her today. The year before I started at Coburg High School in 1961, the houses, formerly named only as colours, were given the names of distinguished former students. Greenhouse became Carter House, and we all knew that we had an Olympian amongst our former students, though she was so much more than that, as I have since learned. Born in 1912, Doris was a school teacher when, in 1936, she qualified as a high jumper to participate in the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, one of only 4 women in the 33-person team. She was placed 6th, a creditable achievement given that she carried an injured ankle into the finals. The gold medal winning height was actually lower than Doris's Australian record. On her return, she continued as a teacher while also playing interstate hockey and representing Australia a game at the Empire Games in Sydney, where she was 5th with a jump of 5 foot 1 inch. That's quite a jump for a woman. When war broke out, Doris joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in January 1942, and later led the WAF contingent in the Victory March in London in 1946. After this, she took up work in the Department of Post-War Reconstruction, managing child and youth migration. Then in April 1951, she was appointed Director of the Women's Royal Australian Air Force, the RAF, and undertook its successful reorganisation. She stayed there until 1960. An acknowledged leader with a knack for organisation and people management, she spent time as President of the Australian Women's Athletics Union, General Secretary of the YWCA, and with the National Fitness Council of Australia and the Australian War Memorial. Unsurprisingly, she was on the organising committee for the 1956 Olympics and manager of the women's team. Appointed OBE in 1957, it is said that her proudest moment was when she co-led the 1996 Melbourne Anzac Day Parade, the first woman to do so, but only 3 years before her death. I know she has quite some profile as a sporting personality, but why, I asked myself when the Coburg High School History Group was discussing her reinstatement as a role model in the new manifestation of the school. Why was she not in the ADB? I plan to take that up in the near future and perhaps write the entry myself. But in the meantime, I will be happy to receive details of anyone who has recently been teased out of the archives and might be worthy of an entry in a revised ADB. How do we get out of here?
Carolyn, thank you. That was a terrific introduction to the discussion this evening, and what a fascinating story. I wish we'd known about her when we were doing our exhibition on women in World War II.
Yes.
Yeah, didn't come across her then.
No.
Now I'll hand over to Alicia, who will coordinate this first question and session, and then I'll rejoin you after that. Alicia, over to you.
Thanks, Margie. So I'll just invite everybody to have a look at the Q&A button on the bottom menu bar of your Zoom screen. And that is the way that you can put your questions to Carolyn, and I will pass them through. And the very first one that I'm looking at, Carolyn, is that someone's saying the unknown lady on the top line looks quite a bit like Sylvia Bremer or
Yeah,
Bremer.
Yes.
There's a picture in the National Portrait Gallery that looks like it's the one that
I can only assume
where it's taken from.
In the normal, in the editorial process of creating the supplement, that she was left out.
Yes.
The picture stayed on the front page.
Right, absolutely.
It's very familiar too. I'm interested to know.
Yeah. Oh, well, that could be an avenue. Thank you in our audience for contributing there. So I suppose the question, that idea of why don't we know their names, I think for many in the audience tonight, we'll have seen that in our research. We'll have found that in even formal documentation where women are often listed under their husband's names. And going beyond that, there's a question asking how many First Nations women are included in the
The
ADB?
First Nations question, there is an entire working party devoted to a volume of Indigenous entries. There was a big ARC grant is funding that, and the recovery of that work is well underway.
Yes.
Lots and lots of entries are being written, and they're now. The thing is now that the kind of resources that were needed to write those sort of entries have become available. There's access to all kinds of documents and archives. I mean, they were quite difficult to tease out of the archives, out of anywhere. I mean, I think even back in the 1980s, it was really difficult.
Yes.
But they've got a fabulous team working on that, and that's well funded and progressing well.
Good. Yes, you were definitely sort of hinting at that idea of it's the hours of research and writing up, and of course then the finances that are critical. People are interested to know, what are the criteria for women to be included? Is it achievement? How important do they have to be before they get included into the ADB?
Well, the criteria for women are exactly the same as for men. I mean, there has to be, generally speaking, there has to be something just a little bit exceptional about the person. It doesn't matter whether it's a woman or a man. I mean, they're migrant women. We work really hard on being as inclusive and as representative as possible. And the criterion really are that their contribution has been, many of the people who are in there, you'll discover their contribution is more than just in one area. That's more than just doing their standard job well. But with respect to representative women, yes, there is, and men, their effort is to, we want people who are representatives of, as the lovely woman, the Darwin woman who represents the Chinese community in Darwin, where there is a consistent effort all the time to be as inclusive as possible, but also not to leave out people who are just so look upable. I mean, when it is meant to be a history resource, so we do focus on. Yes, thank you, Georgina. We do know, I mean, the idea is that these are people who have made a contribution to Australian society. That's the criteria.
Yes. And to touch on that question that only us panellists can see, and this would be helpful for the rest of the audience, if they are thinking of putting forward a name, what do they have to contribute? What do they have to know about that person? And specifically, looking at sources and sharing those through.
Look, I think we can start by just giving me, someone like me, just giving me a sort of a brief CV, so this is what they did, this is the area they worked in. Of course, I'm only, for me, it's Victorians. There's a couple of criteria here. First of all, they need to be Victorians. And secondly, by and large, we are stopping in 2000. People who died after 2000, the resources that we're going to go back and revise. So they need to be people who died before the year 2000 and, have made a significant contribution. Personally, I think one of our biggest gaps is actually regional. I don't think we have enough people representing the Victorian regions, not enough people from Ballarat and Bendigo, let alone smaller towns.
Okay, so that's a call out to anyone in the audience who might be in the know about regional women, but we've also touched on First Nations, on migrant women.
Yeah. But I don't think the men do terribly well out of those places either.
Right, very good. Well, I might invite Margie back. Thank you, Carolyn, for answering those questions, and to everyone for raising them. Over to you, Margie.
Thank you. Thanks, Alicia. Thank you, Carolyn. That was a terrific start to the evening. Now, our second speaker is Dr. Kathleen Neal. Kathleen, do you want to? Yep, there she is. Kathleen lectures in medieval history at Monash University, and she also manages an academic blog in 13th century England. Her most recent publication is an analysis of the letters of Edward I. And she'll speak tonight about the difficulty of tracing the lives of medieval women through archives that actually paid them little heed. Her presentation is entitled Looking for Elizabeth, Locating Medieval Women in the Archives. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thanks, Margie. Can everyone see this, I hope? Can you tell me, Margaret, if you can see that?
Yes.
So,
yes.
jolly good. Excellent. Thank you. As Margie said at the start, I would like to begin by paying my respects to the elders past, present and future of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people on whose land I live and work. This presentation comes out of a recent request in which I was asked, as part of a major push to expand women's representation in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography for Britain, to contribute an entry on this medieval woman shown here, Elizabeth, one of the daughters of Edward I. This illustration coming from a genealogy from about 1302. Elizabeth was born in 1282. She was the fifth and youngest daughter of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, who survived childhood. In other words, there were many other children, but she was the fifth daughter who lived into adulthood. She was born at Rhuddlan Castle in North Wales in August, the summer of 1282, in the midst of her father's Second Welsh War, in which he actually conquered Wales. Like her sisters, Eleanor, Joan and Margaret, Elizabeth was intended for a diplomatic marriage to strengthen England's relationship with strategic allies. Another sister, Mary, became a nun at a very important Wiltshire convent called Amesbury, where Edward I's own mother had spent her final years. Now, Elizabeth was married twice, as you can see on screen, and her two marriages placed her in important roles in two key phases of her father's and subsequently brother's political strategy. The first, to John, Count of Holland, secured continental allies in a moment when England badly needed support against expansionist French interests. Her second marriage to Humphrey de Bohun, the 4th Earl of Hereford and 9th Earl of Essex, sought to reward and ensure the support of key English magnates and to reintegrate the English political community with the king after a period of turbulence. So Elizabeth was thus a woman of high society and a woman with an active role in politics and diplomacy, both of which frequently played out through family ties in the Middle Ages. Her role in both Anglo-Dutch diplomacy and the turbulent politics of Edward II's reign is likely more critical than we presently know. So the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography is making a concerted effort to increase the representation of noble women and others, although, as you can imagine, in the medieval records, they are even less likely to be found, in its digital pages. And as you can see from these statistics, the need to do so is very real. And there are some very close similarities to Carolyn's challenges that she was just mentioning here. Overall, the ODNB includes over 61,000 individual biographical entries, but only 11.8% of those are women. And the proportion is considerably worse in the Middle Ages. Before 1485, which is the dictionary's cutoff for the beginning of the Tudor period and the end of the Middle Ages, there are 4,739 entries, but only 312 women, a little under 6.6%. And in fact, some of those are mentioned only in passing in group entries on their families, husbands or fathers. So women are not well represented in the ODNB, although they're rectifying that as we speak. And of course, there is an argument to be made that the poor showing of medieval women in this dictionary in some respects reflects the biases of medieval evidence. It's not uncommon, for example, that a medieval chronicle would fail to mention the names of wives or daughters of a protagonist by name, or that it could fail to mention them at all, despite the importance that they had as partners in their husbands' affairs through the institution of marriage, let alone as landowners and lords of lands in their own right. But it's not just about the silence of the evidence. Although, as we'll see shortly, medieval women can be hard to locate in archives for various reasons, evidence for their lives is actually reasonably plentiful, while admittedly fragmentary, in the archives of medieval English government when you look carefully and strategically, and provided that they are the kind of women who had some interaction with officialdom. So rather than focus on the dictionary's poor coverage, which they're fixing, what I want to focus on in the rest of my presentation is the challenge to teasing women's stories from the archives themselves. In particular, I want to consider the research challenge that's inherent in the relationship between the nature of medieval documentary evidence on the one hand and the history and structure of archival catalogues on the other. So let's take a look at this archive, the one I know best, the National Archives of the UK at Kew in Surrey. This is the repository of all official government records, technically of Britain, but really of England, the earliest of which dates back to 1086 Domesday Book. The medieval materials in this archive relate to English royal government in its many guises. For example, the King's control over his lands in France, Wales, Ireland and Scotland, the archives of the Duchy of Lancaster, which had long been a property of the Crown, the archives of the Exchequer, Chancery and the Royal Courts, and an enormous volume of diplomatic materials on the King's relationship to foreign powers, including, for instance, the papacy. To a lesser extent, it includes private family materials, most of which it came into possession of through reasons of a family being embroiled in a royal legal case and submitting documentation to the courts that never found its way back. So this is undoubtedly an archive of an official nature, one in which women's lives and affairs might be recorded only in specific and occasional ways when they interacted with royal concerns. This is not to say that women were not involved in literate production and culture in medieval law and administration. As the late Philippa Madden pointed out, any woman with rights over or possession of land and resources had to be prepared to take a share in the massive textual activity that was involved in determining and maintaining ownership. And an example can be seen in Louise Wilkinson's recent edition shown here of the household account of Eleanor, Countess of Leicester for 1265. As Wilkinson shows here, Countess Eleanor, who was sister of King Henry III and wife of his chief opponent, worked actively at political, family and estate management and kept meticulous records of all of her financial and other affairs. But the survival of this kind of document is rare indeed. So even extremely elite women who were active producers and managers of the records of their own lives are not likely to have left significant traces in the modern archival record, which tends to have been produced for and by the protection and documentation of the long interests of patrilineal noble families or of government. The daily administration of even a countess's household had little bearing on such priorities. And feminist life cycle analysis has revealed more depth to this issue. When the collection principle is that of government policies, even women of royal background, like Elizabeth, who is my topic tonight, impinge only occasionally on official records. On the other hand, not only creating lacunae, this shows the moments that were important in government eyes that linked women to political society. This graph illustrates the frequency of items linked to Elizabeth by name in the modern catalogue of the National Archives, and it maps the peaks and troughs against her life cycle. We can see that there is essentially no record of her childhood, but that her first diplomatic marriage to the Count of Holland in 1297 created a large amount of documentation. We can also see that her participation in royal life as a widow between 1299 and 1302 created its own documentary traces, and that her second political marriage to Humphrey de Bohun, an important magnate of the realm, also impinged on royal document production in specific ways. Finally, we can notice the stark absence from the records of the reign of her brother between 1308 and 1313, which was probably a result of the fact that Earl Humphrey, her second husband, was among the chief opponents of Edward II during this time. So this graph shows us how Elizabeth moves in and out of the official records, not according to her own position in society per se, but according to the priorities and purposes of the documentation which has given rise to this archive. So let's take a look at a couple of examples and consider how we can reconcile our desire to tell her story with the skewed nature of the records that survive. My first example, where's it gone? Go back. There we go. My first example is this list of articles of plate issued from the Royal Treasury to Elizabeth on the occasion of her first marriage. Together, the many items of silver and gold that she was given in this account were valued at a staggering £315, 5 shillings and 4pence, an indicator of the level of investment the royal government was making in the Hollandaise alliance. Now, this account was preserved not because that alliance or Elizabeth's position in it was particularly important for documentary production, but because it was necessary for the accountability of household clerks. But nevertheless, it gives us an important insight into the materiality of her new position and its connection to diplomatic display and performance. Among the articles with which she was issued, for example, were several that bore the royal arms of England, sometimes but not always, together with those of Holland. This shows us that she was supposed to wear the physical manifestation of this alliance upon her person in order to perform her diplomatic role. This morse or clasp, now in the Walters Art Museum, is an example very like some that were listed in this account and sent to Holland with Elizabeth. It was probably made for her mother, since it carries the royal arms of England and Castile. And articles like this materially branded the Countess as a link between her new county and the realm of her birth. Unfortunately, we know little of Elizabeth's activities as Countess of Holland. Her marriage was short-lived and childless, and allegedly brought to an end by a murder in which her father was rumoured to have been implicated. Plenty to be said there. Consequently, Elizabeth struggled to make a place for herself in Holland in widowhood, and she was unable to exert enough pressure to secure her dower lands and properties. So she returned to England, still a teenager and widow, to take up a semi-official position as the companion to her father's second wife, Margaret of France. And it's precisely because of her tenuous political and financial position that we find her in the records of royal government once again. For instance, in this account, we see meticulous records of the expenses to the king's purse that were incurred by transporting his daughter's small retinue of attendants around the kingdom. It was nothing like the grandeur of her first marriage trousseau. She was allowed no more than 1 to 2 pence per day for almsgiving, and a little more on significant feast days. But it does show the royal government taking charge of her finances and integrating her into royal life at this time. These examples strongly illustrate the challenge that the interaction between a woman's life cycle and the habits of medieval royal record keeping bring to teasing stories from the archives. And what of the modern archive itself? Like many women, as Alicia was just referring to, Elizabeth is known by various names and titles as her circumstances changed. And this creates another specific problem. The cataloguing system at TNA, like many archives, uses the identifying labels within the document itself. And this means that for many medieval women and some men, there is no standard system of identifying them in the catalogue. So Elizabeth appears in the catalogue of TNA as the Countess of Holland on 34 occasions. But she also appears separately as the Countess of Hereford upon her second marriage in 1302 on 74 occasions. So consequently, even just to create a history based on documents where she is named in the catalogue entry, we have to perform a number of separate searches using different spellings, different titles, and all of the possibilities that are already known to us, as well as sifting these results to remove false positives and accidental duplicates. This, as well, is only one tip of the iceberg of the challenge. Even individuals who operate in the orbit of the royal household, in fact, do not appear frequently as the principal person associated with a single documentary record. So they rarely appear in the named catalogue description. Instead, they appear as passing mentions in much larger government records, like the enormous registers of enrolled correspondence or the financial accounts of the royal household, the exchequer, or one of the courts or other offices. The example you can see here is an account roll for the royal household of Edward II between the 9th and 15th years of his reign, and it contains multiple records in which Elizabeth is mentioned, although she does not appear at all in the catalogue entry. So the only way to find her here is to unroll all of the membranes of this enormous document and read it line by line, spotting, if you can, the telltale words comitisse herefordie, as we do here in the Jocalia or Treasury list. These tidbits are rare, but they're worth the hunt, because when we do find her, here for instance, we discover that Edward II was so attached to his sister that he kept a golden cup that she had given him in his treasury long after her death, even though all of the other items he had received as gifts in that same year had since been regifted. The king's affection for his sister is also attested in this rather fabulous item, affectionately known as the hairy account book. But once again, Elizabeth does not appear in the catalogue entry. Within its pages, however, among many relevant entries, we find evidence of this special favour shown to Elizabeth at the king's gift, here in the New Year's gifts of 1316. We can see that the gold circlet he gave her was second in value only to that given to Queen Isabella, and was more valuable even than the present that the king gave his own son, the future Edward III. Evidence like this puts Elizabeth right at the centre of royal favour, and it's inconceivable that she didn't use this position, especially when her second husband became embroiled in opposition to her brother's reign. That gift of the golden cup that we just saw, to which Edward was so attached, may indeed have been a peacemaking offering from a beloved sister, playing an important role in mediating conflict among elite political society. Elizabeth's life story can only be gleaned in fragments, but by analogy with other elite women like her great aunt, Eleanor de Montfort, the Countess of Leicester, and by the evidence of objects like this seal impression from about 1300, we know that she would have taken her share in the management of her estates and her roles in life. As diplomatic bride, aristocratic intercessor, political mediator, estate manager, wife, and mother. There would have been letters, accounts, charters, and other documents formalising her grants and pious donations, and we know that there was a will which does not survive. Elizabeth lives on mainly in the archives of her father and brother's reigns and at their priorities. Her work as wife to two counts left few documentary traces, at least to us. It was less important for her family to preserve than the legal deeds that demonstrated their entitlement to lands and the political and military feats of her menfolk. And unfortunately, the Benedictine convent that her family supported, and which may have been a repository for her more private documents, was destroyed in the Reformation. We will never know what was lost. It's been a challenge to piece together the fragments of Elizabeth's life, but the outcome suggests that she and many women like her are more deserving of inclusion in the ODNB as significant contributors to British life than was previously supposed. And if you'd like to know more about Elizabeth, why not check out these published works or wait until May when the next ODNB series of entries should be available. Thank you for your attention.
How wonderful, Kathleen. Thank you so much for taking us through that story of Elizabeth. But for me, that absolutely fascinating reflection on the archives and how, you know, where you found her story and where you didn't find it. I think that's a huge part of your research. And if anyone has any questions for Kathleen, just drop them into that Q&A box and I'll pass them through. But I wanted to say, while people are thinking of their questions, I wanted to say it was so obvious how much you love the archives.
I do. I miss them terribly.
Yes.
And one of the great delights, though, of modern research is how connected you can be without being present.
Yes.
So I'm well networked with lots of the medieval specialists who work at TNA,
yes,
who've sometimes gone and taken a photograph of something for me if I really need it, which has been a very precious blessing over the past 12 months, as you can imagine.
Absolutely critical, I'm sure. We've had a question come in asking about the types of sources that the ONDB might use. So does it privilege documents over objects to tell a story, would you say?
I think that's traditional, but more and more people are including objects as evidence where they can be specifically associated with a person. It's often quite difficult for medieval objects, though. Even that Morse that I showed is only hypothetically attributed to the ownership of Eleanor of Castile on the basis of the heraldry, but it could have belonged to someone in her retinue, maybe even a priest of her household. It might have been made for the king, given that he was marrying the Princess of Castile. So there's often not very secure provenance for some of those objects, even when they survive in well-documented museum collections. What the ODNB does do, though, is encourage you to locate, if possible, a portrait of the individual. Of course, medieval portraiture is not exactly representative in the way that we think of when we say that word, but there are visual documents that illustrate her, like her seal and like that illustration that I showed right at the beginning from the genealogical roll. So yeah, it's not impossible to integrate material and visual culture into the dictionary, even though it's a relatively new phenomenon.
Yes, yes. And does the search for women become more difficult when you move further back in time than the 13th century?
Yes, it does. In particular, as soon as you step earlier than the Norman conquest. But in fact, probably the reign of Henry III, Edward I's father, there's a real turning point in the volume of documentation that survives. So there's a handful of pipe rolls, the major financial accounts that survive for the reign of King John, sort of late 12th into very early 13th century. But by the time you get to Henry III, as has been traced by the ingenious method of counting up the expenses on sealing wax, in Henry III's reign, the documentary production just expands exponentially.
Okay.
And with it, the likelihood of finding even these fragmentary elements of women's lives as they pass through the courts or royal finances.
Yes. And someone's asking, how are the ODNB making decisions on which medieval and early modern women to include?
Well, what they started doing a couple of years ago is reaching out to scholarly societies and asking for nominations, both of people who might be profiled and of people who could write the entry. In other words, reaching out to people who might be researching a certain family or individual at the time and saying, please, if you think this person should be included, write to us. And so they've commissioned, I understand, a couple of hundred pre-modern biographies, especially of women, which will go some way to redressing at least the difference between the medieval and modern representation of women, but there's still a long way to go for parity across the board.
Yes. And I think this is a question for later on when we have you all together, but I'm really interested in you know, what are the reflections between the the ADB and the ODNB, and how the different organisations are approaching it, and what that looks like. And there are some really wonderful questions here, but I think we'll have to hold them over.
Sure.
So thank you so much, Kathleen, for your presentation and for kindly answering those questions. And I'll pass back to Margie.
Great.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Alicia. That was wonderful. Now, I seem to be occupying full screen here. I'm not quite sure why, but we'll do that just briefly while I introduce our third speaker this evening, who is Dr. Alana Piper of the University of Technology, Sydney, who's joining us now, I think, where she holds a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Research Fellowship in the Australian Centre for Public History. Alana's research interest is the history of crime, and her current project is a fascinating one, Criminal Characters, which uses digital history to trace the lives and the criminal history of offenders in 19th and 20th century Australia. She's done a lot of work in the records at Prov, and she's published some wonderful papers from that work. Her paper this evening is entitled Freeing Female Prisoners from the Archives, Understanding Criminality in Context. Welcome, Alana.
Thanks, Margaret. So I wanted to start tonight's presentation by actually posing a question to the audience. What type of woman do you imagine when you picture a female prisoner from the late colonial or Federation period? Perhaps you imagine someone like Lily Walker. Walker was certainly someone that residents of late 19th and early 20th century Melbourne may well have thought of when they imagined a female criminal. A well-known prostitute pickpocket, Walker was tried 10 times for robbing men between 1883 and 1908. Although not convicted on every occasion, she was imprisoned several times and was undoubtedly part of Melbourne's criminal subculture. Occasion when she refused a bribe to name another female thief by proclaiming, "Us girls won't put one another away." Walker's criminal career, in Melbourne at least, in 1908, when she was convicted of robbing a clergyman and was given an indefinite prison sentence as a habitual criminal under legislation passed in Victoria the year before allowing such measures. Seen as a threat to persons, property, and morality, Walker, as a matter of law, thus embodied the very archetype of criminality in this period. Women like Walker, or others whose crimes attracted infamy in century Victoria, such as baby farmer Frances North. Oh, sorry, did you want me to stop the video?
No, not necessarily. You're breaking up a little bit, so I'll let you know if it happens again, and perhaps we'll take the video out.
Okay. Women like Walker, or others whose crimes attracted infamy in turn of the century Victoria, such as baby farmer Frances North, have remained the embedded image of historical female criminality, in part because they were viewed as women who not only committed crimes, but embodied a type of criminal identity. My talk today criminal identities by discussing the need to look beyond the surface of archival documents in order to understand female criminality in context. Am I coming through all right now?
That you're breaking up a little bit. I wonder if we should just take the video out and just proceed.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So part of the reason that it is essential to practice records pertaining to crime is to counteract the certainty with which 19th century authorities and commentators often approach questions of criminality. Women like Walker were not only viewed as classes, an underworld that at the time was considered distinct from the rest of humanity, not only morally, but in tangible physical ways. cataloguing the means by which era's great transnational projects contributed to from a range of established and emerging disciplines, including medicine, alienism, social work, criminology, and policing. Bumps on the head, hair growth, distance between the eyes, all were measured to glean insights into what set criminals apart from the non-criminal. The idea that these criminal classes were readily distinguishable from the general populace in visible ways saturated the broader culture, with women often dominating this imagery, from caricatures of women with masculine or atavistic features to descriptions of visits to underworld hotspots, particularly female waifs, bleary-eyed prostitutes, and coarse-featured indigent old women. Drawing on such middle class accounts and sources, early social historians accepted these depictions as reality, only starting to question the existence of the criminal classes in the 1970s, as access to archival documents such as court and prison records started to point to much more prosaic realities in which crime, and especially female crime, was often an impulse driven by economic necessities or social constraints of the period. 19th century authorities were themselves aware that their conception of criminality as a distinct and fixed identity failed to account for all criminal activity. This is evident in efforts made to quantify the extent of the criminal underworld. In 1869, for example, police from throughout the colony of Victoria were tasked with producing an estimate of the criminal population from each district, divided by gender, age, and criminal type. Important in this exercise is the implicit recognition it offers that the criminal population was understood to represent something different than the number of individuals simply arrested or imprisoned for crime in the annual government returns, given that the number of such women was much higher. Such distinctions would become even more apparent in the early 20th century, when the phrase habitual criminal took on new meaning with Victoria's introduction of the 1907 Indeterminate Sentences Act, perhaps the era's strongest expression of certainty in the ability to designate individuals as part of a criminal other. Victoria's legislation, which was far more draconian and wide-reaching than that of other jurisdictions, decreed that anyone could be judged a habitual criminal and held indefinitely if they had been convicted of 3 or more indictable offences, 3 or more summary offences, or if they had been convicted of a single offence, but their character left the judge satisfied that they should be declared a habitual criminal. Despite these very liberal provisions for discretionary identification of offenders from the criminal element, the number of both men and women sentenced under the Act was ultimately quite small. By 1918, only 3 women were being held on indeterminate sentences. So this points to 2 ironies. Firstly, while the period 1860 to 1920 was one of high public anxiety in Victoria about female criminality, it was also a period in which the actual number of female offenders, or at least women being imprisoned, was in sharp decline. Secondly, the cautious use of the habitual criminals legislation indicates that when put to the test, officials realised that the distinction between the criminal and persons who happen to have committed crimes was more nebulous than previously supposed. Indeed, marching alongside the belief that criminals were distinct and knowable in 19th century discourse was the creeping fear that criminality was also becoming increasingly concealable. Industrialisation and the growing ease of travel stimulated suspicions that anonymous urban environments were rife with individuals pretending to be something or someone they were not for malign purposes. Many of the distinctively female offences that commanded attention during this period were depicted as involving such deceptions, from murderous baby farmers convincing desperate mothers that they would lovingly care for their infants, through to procuresses ensnaring girls into prostitution by presenting themselves in the guise of employers, boarding housekeepers, or even charity workers. The ease with which individuals with criminal intentions could assume the mantle of respectability was a preoccupation of the period. Some commentators suggested that the problem was exacerbated in the colonies, where mobility was frequent and the greater freedom of behaviour enjoyed by both women and the working classes made it more difficult to use typical markers such as dress and demeanour to distinguish between respectable and not so respectable women. These complexities need to be borne in mind when encountering historical records in which people categorise a woman as a criminal character. The fragility of female reputation at the time was such that even benign activities could render women suspect figures. Victoria's police correspondence files readily demonstrate this through letters from concerned citizens accusing their female neighbours of prostitution on the basis of their having male visitors, venturing out at night, using bad language, or simply their style of dress. Police investigation of these complaints often suggested they were baseless. However, the ability of even the police themselves to recognise criminals was dramatically called into question during this period through several high-profile cases of wrongful arrests in which respectable women were apprehended as offenders. In 1864, a letter was thus sent to Victoria's Chief Secretary from the Melbourne Police Magistrate's Office recommending the immediate discharge of Elizabeth Webster, recently imprisoned on a 2-month sentence for being a disorderly prostitute on the street. In something of an understatement, the police magistrate declared that the girl is not so depraved as at first appeared. In fact, Webster's mother had come forward with evidence that her daughter was only 14, had been on the street because she had been sent to buy some fish for the family's dinner, and was arrested simply because she happened to walk by a group of women the police were apprehending as prostitutes. Such cases point to the dangerousness of implicitly relying on police assessments of women or even conviction records as evidence of actual criminal behaviour. Similarly, the absence of conviction records cannot simply be interpreted as indicating an absence of criminal activity, particularly given the gendered and class notions of criminality that pervaded at this time. Such views are revealed in a telling remark by turn-of-the-century police detective Alfred Stephen Bevett, who in his memoir of his time on the force observed that it must be remembered that it is not always criminals who commit offences or crimes. Bevett's remark was made in the context of recalling an investigation during which an upper-class woman stole cash from her husband, then tried to blame the theft on the maid. As the husband declined to press charges against his wife, this event left no lasting impression in historical criminal records. As much as 19th century commentators were preoccupied by the supposed existence of a distinct criminal class, this was also the era when significant concerns began to emerge about middle-class criminality. However, middle-class offenders, and particularly middle-class female offenders, were often not regarded by the authorities as criminals or treated as such when their offences were brought to official attention. In 1888, the judge in the trial of Maria Rappaport, a city councillor's wife accused of theft, courted public outcry when he ignored the jury's guilty verdict, directing a finding of not guilty on the grounds that she must have been suffering a kleptomaniacal impulse and discharged her into the care of her husband. Such episodes provide an important window into how offenders' backgrounds guided policing and prosecutions during this period, and the gaps about female crime that likely appear in historical records as a result. Ultimately, though, close scrutiny of criminal archives suggests that both women like Rappaport and Walker represent outliers when considering female offender revealed by criminal records, who was neither middle class nor part of a criminal underworld. Rather, a study of the information detailed in the prison records of the 6,042 women whose names were entered in Victoria's Central Prison Register between 1860 and 1920 suggests that the vast majority were employed in working class occupations, principally domestic service, were convicted only once or twice, were imprisoned merely as the result of petty offences such as vagrancy or disorderly conduct. Taken cumulatively, this data thus suggests that few women in the criminal records actually embody cultural connotations that historically attached to the loaded term criminal. Once again, though, questioning these archival records more closely results in a more complex perspective. Looking firstly at the occupation data, understanding the method through which prison records were compiled is important to judging the overall veracity of the information contained. For questions such as occupation, prison officers relied on women's own descriptions of their employment histories, something which some women might have had many reasons to dissemble about. Most notably, out of over 6,000 female prisoners, less than 1% gave their occupation as prostitute, a figure that we might treat with some skepticism. Another weakness of the data is that prison officials seldom updated occupational information across women's lifetimes, simply on the same page that had been created for them on their first entry into the prison system. For example, Beatrice Phillips was listed as a servant, but one wonders how often she was engaged in domestic service between her first conviction at age 18 in 1896 and her last one aged 66 in 1944, during which time she amassed 153 convictions, mostly for drunkenness, property damage, larceny, and soliciting prostitution. On the other hand, engagement in criminal subcultures does not preclude occasional employment in working class occupations, as even for inveterate offenders, solitary means of support. In a report to the Chief Secretary about Sophie Ryan, declared an habitual criminal in 1911, it was thus noted that while she also had a string of previous actions for minor offences, at the time of her most recent arrest, she had been working in South Yarra's OK Jam factory, then a large employer of women. The lives of so-called criminal women thus overlap significantly with those of other working class women. The number of convictions that women amassed likewise does not always tell the full story about their actual level of criminal offending or the extent to which they would have been considered criminal. Julie Colley, listed as a governess on her prison record, amassed 16 convictions between 1906 and 1915, all for drunkenness offences. By the 1890s, officials were regularly complaining about the number of women who simply cycled in and out of prison for drunkenness offences. The creation of inebriated institutions in the early 20th century was partly a response to concerns that an alternative form of institutionalisation was needed for women it was felt were not truly criminal. Conversely, low levels of conviction did not necessarily indicate lack of criminal involvement, particularly given that women were significantly more likely than men to be acquitted at trial for serious crimes. The prison records of Sarah Jones and Kate Clancy show them to be single conviction offenders imprisoned for a solitary act of larceny in 1914. However, court records reveal that they had previously been tried unsuccessfully for robberies in almost identical sets of circumstances. The details of these cases suggest that the women, like Lily Walker, were practiced pickpockets who routinely solicited and robbed men together, using the money to feed their significant alcohol habits. The meaning that attached to the types of offences women were convicted of are likewise not always as straightforward as they might appear. For some women, convictions for drunkenness were aberrant events in their lives, resulting from attempts to impose middle-class standards of behaviour on the working classes. For others, such convictions point to serious addiction. Similarly, a vagrancy conviction could indicate simple poverty that can hardly be considered blameworthy or criminal. On the other hand, police also sometimes used this catch-all offence to remove women from the streets that they considered genuine threats to public safety. Lily Walker was one such woman. After several unsuccessful prosecutions of her in the 1890s for larceny, police decided to use a vagrancy charge to try to protect male citizens from her predations, if only temporarily. The newspaper report of her hearing on vagrancy charges, in turn, gives some insight into the circumstances that may have compelled Walker's criminal activities, revealing that her husband had gone to seek his fortune on the Western Australian goldfields, leaving her with limited means of support. Historical records and archives can thus reveal the complex processes that resulted in women becoming subjects of the criminal justice system. But such archives must also be treated and always be treated carefully to avoid reinscribing women with 19th century values and methods of defining criminality. As a historian, possibilities that digitisation opens up for linkage between crime archives and other types of records, and the potential this offers to develop more holistic views of offenders' lives beyond their criminal activity. Yet, as historical criminologist Barry Godfrey has recently explored, digital exposure to the ruined lives revealed in crime records may convey little meaning to the public or even breed contempt in generating digital archives, particularly sensitive records such as those relating to crime. Careful work is thus needed in order to ensure that women's experiences are understood and interpreted in a proper historical context. Thank you.
Alana, thank you very much. She seems to have disappeared. Alicia, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And what a variety of offences and women you're looking at there. One of whom I recognise, Beatrice Phillips. It was my favourite, I think. What a career. Alicia, over to you for questions. And then do you want to, at the end of, yes, at the end of that, do you want to just open it up for general questions? I think that will be quicker and make better use of time.
Yep,
okay.
Sounds great. And I'll pass straight through to Susie. Thanks, Margie. Thanks, Alana. And yes, sorry to anyone who didn't quite catch. We had some technical glitches here and there. I really enjoyed your exploration and coming straight off Kathleen's presentation, that idea of where women's names are appearing in the records. Was that, did you have sort of similar challenges with women, appearing in different ways with different names? Is that something you've seen in your work?
Sorry, you're cutting in and out for me. It seems like you're asking about women's names and do they disappear and reappear? Yes. Is that right? Yeah. The Victoria's Central Register of Prisoners is a sort of terrific starting point for attempting to do a live history, in that they did try to at least record subsequent age and sort of keep track of women within the system, so you can sort of follow through. That said, that sort of record keeping, again, is a fallible system, and so eventually realise that some women have been recorded in there twice, and so those that's 6,042 women. Didn't start off as 6,042 women. There's more women in there, but through processes of elimination of women who are sort of appearing multiple times under different alias identities, and sometimes prison officials themselves, would start a new page for a woman under a sort of a new right on the page, actually identical to, prisoner number 452 or whatever the case may be. So, but yes, certainly you've sort of got to follow of records to be able to know for certain if they're the same woman every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, it sounds like there's that echo in each of the panelists' experiences in terms of where you're finding the women in the archives. And there's a question here, and I do invite anyone in the audience to put your questions in the Q&A box. Do women appear more as criminals or complainants in the records, such as in the police gazettes?
So I haven't actually looked quantitatively at the police gazettes to see if they're more as criminals or as more often in there as complainants, just because women historically, have tended to be around 10 to 20% of the sort of total number of offenders going through the criminal justice system at any one time. But certainly that question of them coming through as complainants in the police gazette, often they're particularly as victims of gendered sorts of offence. Late 19th and early 20th century, they come through very often as deserted wives complaining of missing husbands and trying to seek husbands that have gone missing to get some sort of support, which, as in the case of Lily Walker, could be a pathway for them into criminal offending, or rather, sort of desperate circumstances that drove them to criminal offending.
There seems like there's so many layers to what you're researching in terms of looking at that gendered approach to how women were reported on.
Yes, and also important too, like these aren't mutually exclusive categories. So Lily Walker obviously appears as an offender in those police gazette records, but also pops up several times in the police gazettes too as a victim. She herself is robbed at times by male customers, as well as at other times robbing male customers in turn.
Yeah. Now, there's a good suggestion here, because we are sort of losing you here and there, Alana, that if there are specific questions that come into the Q&A, you might even be able to type in a response. But I think now what I'll do is invite Kathleen and Carolyn to join us, as well as Susie, to host this final group conversation around our Teasing Women's Lives from the archives and their stories. So over to you, Susie.
Thanks, Alicia. Do we have about 5 minutes of questions left now? Yes,
I think
Yes,
so.
we do.
Yeah.
Yes, we have 5 minutes. So
thanks. So I might start with a very good question to bring you all into this. Jennifer Lord asks, moving into the future, are the panelists confident that current policy settings for archives are adequate to make sure that women start to be adequately recorded and represented?
That's a really good question. I think it depends what we expect of archives. Because, for instance, speaking on the National Archives that I know well, they are archives of government. So the question is really, how has life changed so that women are now actually much more part of that record than they might have been in the 13th century, rather than changing sort of collection habits of that particular archive. But that might not apply in, for example, regional archives, local county archives, something like that. The policy settings there for collection might be the thing that needs to change, as opposed to the participation and the recording of participation that is already changing, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I presume that to some extent it would require some kind of outreach, because there's a lot of people who it wouldn't occur to them that the collection of letters they have will be of interest to an archive. I think there would have to be, I mean, I think I would see some value in working through local historical societies to encourage community outreach, to encourage women to think about things that they just think as household items, I suppose, collections of letters, particularly sorts of things I'm thinking about, as of some value that are worth collecting. But then, having said that, you know, the resources, the financial resources, the storage resources that archives have at the moment are continually under threat. So the idea that they might actively go out and seek records, in addition to the ones that actually do arrive anyway, it's a very tricky question, because archives cost a lot of money. Just keep things there that somebody might only look at once in 100 years. So it's a tricky question. I think it's probably better if we think about getting the stories.
Yeah, like as physical. I got on the question of sort of, you know, physical archives, and as physical archives increasingly become digital, I think one really important question is, you know, what gets digitized, because obviously digitization really often dictates historical research and what historical research does get undertaken these days because of, you know, financial considerations and path of least resistance sort of factors sometimes. That, you know, that's the easiest entry point for PhD research, is to start with digital archives and then go to the physical.
My sense is though that the interest in women's history by women, I mean, we're all sitting here, is sufficiently great that actually I think archives are under quite a lot of kind of natural pressure to digitise the records that are most interesting to people like us. I think the situation is quite positive, really. It's much the same with the Indigenous, with Indigenous women's entries. I mean, part of the reason why it's become possible, and it's not just Indigenous women, it's just Indigenous people, is that the archives have digitised and found ways of making accessible all sorts of records that enable a life story to be put together, which were often buried and lost and not very well catalogued and all kinds of things until quite recently.
Here's another question that you might all be interested in as well. Does it take more time to research the lives of women, both because of barriers to funding, but also because of the particular training that it clearly takes for you all to do this work? I mean, I can see, particularly for Alana and Kathleen, you need to be very carefully trained in theories and methods for retrieving your sources, and even for thinking very carefully about the ones that do leave a trace.
Yeah, I think both funding and time and training are, well, funding, time and training are all critical limiting factors on how much research of this kind can be done in general, and especially for the Middle Ages, especially by researchers from Australia, right? You've got to get the funding and the time to be in London, or, as Carolyn was just suggesting, work on, or perhaps it was Alana, on digitised materials. And then even when you work on digitised materials, you need the training and the time to read line by line and look just on the off chance that someone is mentioned. So yeah, that absolutely applies to me. I'm sure it applies to others.
I think you have to have, I mean, I don't see it as womanist because I said I started, my whole kind of interest in history is about history from below. In other words, finding the people who are not normal in the historical record. So I don't see this as a distinctively gender issue, because what you're looking for a lot of the time is understanding the gaps and the spaces and the places where there aren't records, but maybe if you look over here or around there, or you find something that just gives you a little clue to fill in that gap, or follow another trail, or understand that, in fact, libraries and archives actively, because I work in fairly politically sensitive stuff back in the 20th century, that they actively don't collect certain things because they're seen as subversive, or, you know, so that I think the training is probably much the same for a lot of history in that sense.
Yeah, I would agree with the others. Obviously, working in criminal records, part of the attraction is because those records are a way of doing that history from below, and there's, you know, a wealth of record material available through those criminal archives. But the sort of difficulties, I guess, really comes back to that point that I was trying to make, that, you know, the archives can lie, and they can particularly lie about women because of the sort of, you know, gendered assumptions that were made historically about them, and the sorts of frames that the record keepers and record makers were then sort of operating through. So it's just, yeah, a matter of the training to sort of understand those nuances and reading between the lines of the records.
Thank you. We might have to wrap it up there because we've now gone for 8 minutes. So I think I'll hand it back over to Margaret.
Thanks, Susie, and thank you once again to all of the speakers. They were wonderful presentations, and I think what was so marvellous was the breadth across time, space, and class of those presentations. Even though the same theme was underpinning all of them, the common theme of writing women's lives into history, and the most important work that all of you have been doing. So thank you so much for those presentations. And to those of you who asked questions which we weren't able to get to, my apologies. There have been some very interesting comments made in the chat facility there. So if you have a look through those, you'll see some interesting comments and questions that have come up. But overall, I think it's been a wonderful introduction to Women's History Month here in Victoria. Some fascinating questions about women's lives, some interesting questions about archives and where they might go in the future. It did remind me that at least we may have some of the census records being kept, and they might provide some insight into ordinary people's lives once they're available, perhaps. Can I now thank the team that puts together the Making Public History conference again, seminars again. Bear with me, I'm bringing up the screen share again. The Making Public History seminar series, of course, is put together by the history program at Monash University, the History Council of Victoria, and the Old Treasury Building. And we're also fortunate to have the very generous sponsorship of Monash University Publishing, which kindly provides each of our speaker with a book of their choice from their recent publication list. And some of those are showing on your screen now. Those books should be on their way to you shortly, folks, so I hope that you'll receive them soon. Now, our next seminar, and I'm hoping that this is going to respond. No, it's still not, which is annoying me exceedingly. The next seminar will be coming up on Thursday, the 22nd of April, on the topic Infectious Disease and Public Health, Lessons from History. So extremely topical. And bookings for that seminar are now open on the History Council website. So get yourself there and register fast. Finally, thanks to our audience, our friends, supporters, and participants, because it's your continuing interest and active participation that keeps this seminar series so vibrant and engaging and so varied. So thank you all. Thank you for staying with us tonight, and good night.